The dust of Dodge City, Kansas was a relentless presence, a fine ochre powder that coated everything. The faces of weary travelers, the hides of bawling cattle, and the worn planks of the boardwalks. It was the summer of 1870, and the air hung thick with the smell of sweat, dung, and the faint coppery scent of blood from the nearby slaughterhouse. Under the unforgiving sun, the cattle market was a cacophony of human and animal noise, a place where fortunes were made and lost with a handshake. But on this particular day, a different kind of commerce drew a crowd. Away from the main pens near a weathered livery stable, a spectacle had been set up. A tall, strong-limbed Native American woman, her hands and feet bound in thick iron chains, stood on a makeshift platform. Her buckskin tunic was torn and stained with what looked like old blood, and her long black hair was tangled and dusty. She was a striking figure, not just for her heritage, but for her sheer size. She was taller than most men in the crowd, her frame powerful and muscular, a testament to a life lived in hardship and strength. A gaudy-dressed man with a greasy mustache, a self-proclaimed trader, bellowed to the gathering crowd. "A specimen, folks, a true specimen, captured from a renegade tribe out in the territories, strong as a bull, a working woman you won't find the likes of anywhere. Look at her. No one would buy this giant native woman." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Hard to break, they say. She's been in chains at the market for weeks. No one wants to buy a problem." The words were a calculated humiliation, but the woman, Kiona, remained impassive. Her dark eyes, deep and filled with a sorrow that transcended anger, scanned the faces in the crowd. They were a sea of contempt, curiosity, and mockery. Men nudged each other, pointing at her bound wrists, while women clutched their children and whispered. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, but her spirit, forged by the wilderness and the memory of her people, refused to break. She was not a beast of burden. She was the last remnant of the Oglala Lakota band, whose camp had been ambushed and destroyed by soldiers and bounty hunters. The chains were a symbol of their victory, but her silence was a testament to her unbroken will. As the sun climbed higher, so did the heat, and the crowd began to thin out. The trader, frustrated by the lack of offers, cursed under his breath. He had thought her size would be a selling point, a novelty, but it had instead become a mark of fear. No one wanted a woman who could easily overpower them, a reminder of the frontier's wild and untamed nature. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the dust-choked street. Caleb Cal O'Malley was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very land he worked. His frame was lean and wiry, his face weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines etched around his tired eyes. His worn-out duster and dusty boots spoke of long days on the open range. He was a man of the earth, not of the town. He had come to Dodge City for supplies, barbed wire, feed, and a new plowshare, things he desperately needed for his struggling ranch, a lonely stretch of land, 2 days' ride to the west. He approached the crowd, his gaze not on the spectacle, but on the goods he needed. He was about to turn away when a woman's low moan of discomfort, barely audible over the din, caught his attention. He looked up and saw Kiona. Her head was bowed, her long braids loose and tangled, but he could see the defiant set of her jaw. There was no terror in her eyes, only a profound, bottomless grief. He saw not a savage, but a human being in pain. The trader, sensing a potential buyer, started his pitch again. "Come on, mister, a deal for you. This one's a bargain, strong as an ox." Cal ignored him, his eyes fixed on Kiona. He saw the marks of her suffering, the chafed skin on her wrists, the weariness in her posture. He thought of his own burdens, the drought that was killing his pasture, the loneliness that had settled in his heart since his wife Sarah passed away 2 years ago. He saw a shared sorrow. He saw a person who had lost everything. "How much?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. The trader, taken aback by the directness, stumbled over his words. $1,000, but for you, seeing as you look like a man of the land, I'll make it a deal, 800. A collective gasp went through the remaining crowd. It was an outrageous price, the kind of sum that could set a man up for a lifetime. Cal, however, didn't flinch. He knew he couldn't afford a fraction of that, but something inside him, a quiet, stubborn defiance, pushed him forward. "I don't have that kind of money," Cal said, his gaze unwavering. "But I have this." He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt. It was all he had left after buying his supplies, a few $100s in gold and silver, painstakingly saved. "And I'll buy her to set her free." The trader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Free? What good is she free? She's a runaway risk. The government wants these people on reservations, not running wild." The crowd murmured in agreement. This was an act of lunacy, of pure folly. The rancher was throwing away his future for a woman who was considered nothing more than a dangerous, untamable problem. Kiona, who had been watching the exchange, finally lifted her head. Her eyes met Cal's, and for a moment, the world outside them seemed to disappear. She saw no pity in his gaze, but a strange, quiet resolve. It wasn't a look she was used to from the white man. It was a look of understanding, of a shared burden. Cal, ignoring the trader, addressed Kiona directly. "I can't promise you much, but I can promise you a place where no one will ever put a chain on you again. I can give you a chance to be free." The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the ugliness of the scene. The trader, seeing the transaction was not going to be a simple one, tried to pull Cal's focus back to him, but it was too late. The rancher had made up his mind. He wasn't buying property, he was offering a lifeline. The scene was set. A man on the brink of ruin, a woman at the bottom of a pit of despair, and a world that saw them both as disposable. The journey to his isolated ranch would be long, and the challenges they would face would be greater than any they had ever known. But for the first time in weeks, Kiona felt a flicker of something she had thought was gone forever. Hope. The journey of two broken souls, brought together by an improbable act of mercy, was about to begin. The morning air was still cool, a welcome change from the oppressive heat of the previous day, as Cal and Kiona left the dust and clamor of Dodge City behind. The sun was a soft orange on the horizon, painting the vast open plains in shades of gold and pink. The sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the gentle creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic hoofbeats of Cal's horse. Sundance. Kiona, still in her tattered clothes, sat on the small wooden bench of the wagon. The chains that had bound her were now a pile of cold rusted iron on the floorboards, a grim reminder of her recent past. Cal had paid an exorbitant sum to the blacksmith to have them removed, a cost that left his pockets nearly empty. Her hands, free for the first time in weeks, flexed and ached, the skin raw and bruised. She was still a prisoner, in a way, bound by her trauma and the deep suspicion of her new owner. She was free from the chains, but not from the weight of her past. Cal rode beside the wagon, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. He felt the weight of his decision. He had acted on an impulse of compassion, a rare luxury in his tough life, and now he was faced with the reality of it. He had a stranger on his wagon, a woman from a world he didn't understand, a woman who looked at him with a mixture of wariness and defiance. He didn't know what to say to her, what to do. The silence between them was as vast as the plains they were crossing. He finally broke the quiet. "My name's Caleb. Folks call me Cal." Kiona's eyes flickered to him, then back to the horizon. She didn't speak. The Lakota language was a music of the plains, a melody of her people. But she had little desire to share it with this man. She knew a little English, enough to understand the insults and commands of her captors, but not enough to express the complexities of her pain. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Cal said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I saw you, and I couldn't leave you there." Kiona finally spoke, her voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Why, you a good man?" The question was more of a challenge than a genuine inquiry. Good men, in her experience, were a myth. Cal chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I don't know about good. I'm just a rancher trying to make a living. I guess I saw a piece of myself in you. Something that's been broken." His words hung in the air. Kiona didn't respond, but she watched him more closely now. He didn't try to touch her, didn't look at her like she was a prize or a curiosity. He just rode beside her, a solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the American West. The day wore on, marked by the changing light and the shifting landscape. They passed rolling hills, sparse patches of scrub brush, and the occasional dry creek bed. The sun beat down on them, and the heat began to rise again. Kiona was thirsty, but she would not ask. She would not show weakness. Cal, however, seemed to know. He stopped the wagon by a small hidden spring, a small miracle in the arid land. He dismounted, filled his canteen, and then, without a word, offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it, her hand brushing against his. The contact was brief, but it was the first time they had touched as equals. The water was cool and life-giving. She drank deeply, the coolness a shock to her dry throat. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "You're welcome," Cal replied, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of his lips. It was the first time he had truly smiled since they left the market. As they continued their journey, a tentative truce formed between them. Cal began to point out landmarks, a way of breaking the silence without demanding conversation. "That's the devil's backbone," he said, pointing to a jagged ridge on the horizon. "Looks mean, but it's full of game." He pointed out a hawk circling high above them, red-tailed, always looking for a meal. Kiona listened, her sharp eyes taking in the landscape. She knew this land in a way he never could. She knew the signs of water, the movements of the animals, the language of the wind. She was a daughter of this land, and even in her captivity it spoke to her. That night, they made camp under a blanket of stars so thick and bright they seemed close enough to touch. Cal built a small fire and cooked beans and bacon. He offered Kiona a tin plate, and she ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the salt. As the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows, Kiona finally broke her silence. "You live alone?" Cal stirred the fire with a stick. "Yeah, my wife Sarah, she passed 2 years ago. Sickness." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Kiona heard the grief in the silence that followed. "Just me and the land, and a whole lot of work." He looked at her across the fire, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. "I just want to get back to the ranch. It's a hard life, but it's mine. I hope you'll find a place there too. A place to be free." Kiona didn't respond, but she watched him. She saw not a man who had bought her, but a man who was as lonely and adrift as she was. He hadn't just bought her freedom, he had bought her a chance at a new life, a life she had thought was gone forever. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time she wasn't walking it alone. After 2 long and dusty days, the landscape began to change. The endless flat plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional gnarled oak tree. The air, though still warm, felt cleaner, carrying the scent of wild sage and sun-baked earth. Cal pointed with a thumb over his shoulder. "Just over that rise. My ranch." Kiona felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. What kind of place would it be? Was it truly a place of freedom or just a different kind of prison? When they crested the final hill, she saw it. A small, unassuming ranch nestled in a wide, shallow valley. The main cabin, a modest log structure, stood sentinel beside a barn in desperate need of repair. The fences around the corrals were sagging, and the pasture was a patchwork of dry, yellow grass and dusty soil. It was not a grand ranch. It was a testament to struggle and neglect. A place barely holding on. A lone dog, a scruffy, 3-legged mutt, limped out from the porch barking a greeting. Cal smiled, a tired but genuine expression. "That's Lucky. Don't mind his barking, he's just happy to see a new face." The dog, after a few more hesitant barks, wagged its tail and hobbled over to Cal, who dismounted and knelt to scratch behind its ears. Kiona watched the man and his dog. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes. Cal was not a man of wealth or power, but he was a man who showed kindness to a creature that others might have discarded. He led the wagon to the barn, and Kiona jumped down, her legs stiff from the long ride. She looked around, taking in the small vegetable patch, the rusty tools scattered near the porch, the silent emptiness of the place. It was a picture of quiet desolation. "Make yourself at home," Cal said, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin. "I'll get the horses watered and the wagon unloaded." Kiona hesitated. Where do I sleep?" she asked, her voice quiet. Cal paused, his eyes meeting hers. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't considered the practicalities of a woman living in his cabin. "There's a cot in the corner. I'll sleep out here in the barn." He didn't give her a choice, but his words were a reassurance. He was giving her space, a sign of respect. He was treating her not as a possession, but as a guest. Inside the cabin, Kiona found a single room sparsely furnished. A simple table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a single bed. In the corner, a dusty cot was folded against the wall. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and the air smelled of stale smoke and old wood. It was a home that had been lived in, but for a long time it had not been cared for. It was a reflection of the man who lived in it. Kiona took a moment to herself, her hand tracing the rough wood of the table. She was no longer a spectacle, no longer a slave. She was in a place that offered her a fragile sort of peace. She felt the weight of her trauma, the loss of her people, and the indignity of her capture. She was a survivor, but she was a very broken one. She wondered if this man, this simple rancher, had truly saved her, or if he had just brought her to another kind of purgatory. When Cal came in, carrying a sack of supplies, he found her staring out the small window. He set the supplies down on the table, the sack of flour making a soft thump. "You hungry?" he asked. "I can make some coffee and a warm meal." Kiona nodded, her stomach rumbling. She had been living on scraps for weeks, and the smell of food was intoxicating. She watched as Cal moved about the small cabin with an easy familiarity. He lit a fire in the stove, and soon the cabin was filled with the welcoming scent of brewing coffee. As they ate a simple meal of beans and stale bread, the silence returned, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was not the hostile quiet of the road, but a companionable one. Kiona watched him, his face illuminated by the lamplight. She saw the deep weariness in his eyes, the set of his mouth that spoke of a man who had faced a great deal of hardship. She began to see him not as her rescuer, but as a fellow survivor. After they finished eating, Cal looked at her with a directness that made her uneasy. "I know this ain't much, but it's all I got. I want you to know you're not a prisoner here. You're free to go whenever you want. Just wait until the morning. The plains at night ain't safe." Kiona felt a strange sensation in her chest. A man who had just spent his last coin to buy her freedom was now telling her she was free to leave. It was a gesture of trust she was not used to. It was a sign that he truly meant what he said. "What do you need?" she asked. Cal looked at her, puzzled. "Need? I need a lot of things. A new barn roof, a good year of rain, and maybe a few dozen new cattle." He chuckled dryly. "And I need you to feel safe here." "No," Kiona said, looking him in the eye. "What do you need help with?" "I can help. I am strong. I am not useless." Cal's tired face broke into a hesitant smile. "I got a lot of work to do. But for now, you just rest. We'll talk in the morning." As Kiona lay on the cot that night, listening to the soft sounds of the ranch, she felt a flicker of hope. She was no longer a spectacle in a town square. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a woman, in a place that was not her own, with a man she barely knew. But she was free, and in her own way she was home. The next morning, Kiona woke with the sun, the sounds of the ranch, her new alarm clock, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft rhythm of Cal's movements as he tended to his morning chores. She rose from the cot, her body still stiff, but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She had a purpose now, to earn her keep, to show this man that his impulsive act had not been a mistake. She found Cal by the barn, mending a section of broken fence. The fence posts were old and rotted, and the barbed wire was loose and sagging. The work was slow and meticulous, a testament to the constant struggle of a rancher in a land that fought back. "Morning," he said, not looking up from his work. "Got coffee on the stove, and some leftover biscuits." Kiona nodded, but instead of going inside, she went to a pile of discarded fence posts. She picked up a large log, one that Cal had apparently deemed too heavy, and with a swift, practiced motion, she lifted it onto her shoulder. She walked over to the section he was working on, and without a word began to dig a new post hole with a shovel. Cal stopped his work, watching her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She moved with a silent efficiency, her powerful frame a testament to a life of hard physical labor. She didn't complain, didn't hesitate. She simply worked. "You don't have to do that," Cal said, his voice a little gruff. Kiona didn't stop digging. "You said you needed help. I am help." Cal watched her for a moment longer, then went back to his own work, a small smile on his face. He found himself working a little harder, a little faster, spurred on by her presence. They worked in a silent harmony, the rhythmic sound of the shovel hitting the earth and the clink of Cal's hammer on the wire, creating a new kind of rhythm on the ranch. As the sun rose higher, the day grew hotter, and the work became more grueling. Kiona's hands, though calloused, were not used to the rough feel of a shovel handle, and blisters began to form. She ignored the pain, pushing through the discomfort. She was not going to be a burden. When the sun was at its peak, Cal called for a break. He led them to a small stream that ran through the property, its banks lined with cool green grass. They sat in the shade of a large cottonwood tree, sharing water from their canteens and a meal of hardtack and dried meat. "You're a hard worker," Cal said, leaning back against the trunk. "You've got more grit than a dozen men I know." Kiona looked at him, her eyes steady. "My people, we are not lazy. We work hard to live, to survive." She gestured to the land around them. "This is a hard land. It will not give you anything for free." Cal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right about that. It's taken everything I've got, and then some." He looked off into the distance, his gaze distant. "My wife, she loved this place. She had so many plans. A bigger garden, a new porch, a couple of young'uns running around." His voice was low, filled with a familiar ache. "But the land, it just kept taking. The drought, the sickness. It took her too." Kiona listened, her heart aching with a shared grief. She knew what it was to have plans for a future that was stolen from you. She knew what it was to love a land that could turn on you in an instant. "You are not alone," she said softly. Cal looked at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. "I am. I have been for a long time." Kiona didn't say anything, but she understood. Loneliness was a sickness of the soul, one that she too carried. They finished their meal in silence, a new understanding between them. They were two people from different worlds who had both been broken by the cruelties of life. They were survivors, and they were in this together. That afternoon they worked side by side, their movements more synchronized, their silences more comfortable. Cal showed her how to use a hammer to secure the barbed wire, and she showed him the best way to dig in the tough, rocky soil. He learned that she was not just strong, she was intelligent and resourceful. She saw things he missed, like the small, almost dry creek beds where water could be found, or the signs of a coming storm. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, they finished mending the fence. The ranch looked a little less desolate, a little more cared for. Cal looked at their work with a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Good work," he said, wiping a dusty hand across his brow. "We made a difference today." Kiona looked at the mended fence, her hands aching but her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. "Yes," she said, "we did." The day had been hard, but it had also been productive. It was the beginning of a partnership, an unspoken agreement to help each other survive. The ranch was a fragile thing, and so were they. But together, they just might have a fighting chance. The days on the ranch settled into a routine of hard work and quiet companionship. Kiona's presence had brought a new rhythm to Cal's life. He was no longer a man alone in a desolate place. He had a partner in labor, a silent presence that spurred him on. They worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, clearing brush, and tending to the small, struggling herd of cattle. Kiona was an invaluable asset. Her knowledge of the land was profound. She showed Cal where to find wild berries and herbs for a bit of flavor in their meals. She could track animals and read the weather in the clouds. She had an innate connection to the earth, a connection that Cal, for all his years on the ranch, had never truly cultivated. One afternoon, as they were herding the cattle to a new patch of pasture, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. A lone rider was approaching. Cal tensed, his hand instinctively going to the rifle on his saddle. "Neighbor," he muttered, a hint of unease in his voice. "Doesn't come around often." The rider, a grizzled man with a suspicious squint, rode up to them. He was Jedediah Shaw, a man known for his fiery temper and his open dislike of Native Americans. His eyes, small and beady, immediately landed on Kiona. His gaze was cold and full of contempt. "Afternoon, Cal," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. "Didn't know you were hiring on help, especially this kind of help." Kiona's head went up, her jaw set. She knew that look, the look of hatred and judgment. She had seen it on the faces of the men who had captured her, on the men in the market. "She's a friend," Cal said, his voice firm, a warning in his tone. "She's helping me out with the ranch," Jedediah scoffed. "A friend? A savage woman in your home? You're asking for trouble, Cal. First, they'll be working with you, then they'll be scalping you in your sleep." He spat on the ground near Kiona's feet. "Mark my words, you can't trust 'em." Kiona's hands clenched into fists, but she remained silent. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not let his words break her. Cal's face hardened. "That's enough, Jedediah. You're on my land. I'll ask you to show some respect." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "Respect? For one of them? They're nothing but vermin, Cal. They massacred my brother's family out west. I lost a whole part of my life to them." His voice was filled with a deep, bitter pain. Kiona's heart sank. She knew the history of violence and betrayal. She knew the bitterness and the loss. It was a cycle that had consumed both of their peoples. Cal, however, didn't back down. "And I'm sorry for your loss, Jedediah, but this woman is not your enemy. She's a person." Jedediah laughed, a short, humorless bark. "A person? She's a wild animal. You got her in chains at the market in Dodge City, didn't you? That trader, he was telling everyone what a vicious brute she was. No one would buy her. Not until you, the soft-hearted fool, came along." He looked at Kiona, his eyes full of malice. "Let's see how long she lasts before she turns on you, then you'll be the one in chains." With a final, venomous glare, Jedediah spurred his horse and rode off, the dust cloud he kicked up a symbol of his bitterness. The silence that followed was heavy and charged. Kiona stood rigid, her hands trembling slightly. The man's words, a reflection of the prejudice that had defined her life since her capture, had hit their mark. Cal dismounted and walked over to her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "Jedediah, he's a bitter man. He's not all of us." Kiona finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a raw, fierce emotion. "He is all of you. Your people, they hate us. They take our land, they kill our families, they put us in chains. He is not a bitter man, he is a man of your world. He is right to hate. There is nothing but pain between us." Cal shook his head. "No, there's not. I didn't buy you because of hate. I bought you because of compassion. There are good people, Kiona, people who don't see color, who don't see a race. They see a person." Kiona looked at the horizon, her gaze distant. "My family is gone. My people are gone. I was the last, and his words, they feel like a piece of my people died all over again." Cal felt a deep sense of helplessness. He wanted to tell her that it would be okay, that he would protect her, but he knew those words would be empty. He could not erase the pain of a lifetime of betrayal and loss. He could only offer a small, fragile haven in a hostile world. "We have work to do," he said finally, a simple statement that spoke of his desire to return to the simple, physical labor that made the world make sense again. Kiona nodded, the brief moment of vulnerability passing. She picked up her tools and went back to work. She was a survivor. She would not let the hatred of one man break her. She would work. She would build. And she would find a way to live, even in this world that seemed to be designed to destroy her. The ranch might be her safe place, but the world outside was full of danger, and she knew she would have to be ready for it. The encounter with Jedediah left a bitter taste on the ranch. The unspoken tension between Kiona and Cal was palpable, a reminder of the chasm that existed between their two worlds. Cal, for his part, tried to bridge the gap with kindness and quiet respect. He began to learn a few words of her language, stumbling over the guttural sounds, a small effort that Kiona noticed and appreciated, though she never showed it. One morning, the peace of the ranch was shattered by the frantic bellowing of a cow. Cal, with Kiona close behind, rushed to the pasture. They found the mother cow standing over a small calf, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the dry grass. A coyote had gotten to it, and though it hadn't killed the calf, it had done serious damage. Cal's face was grim. "Damn," he muttered. "It's a clean break. But if it's not set right, it'll get infected, and we'll lose it." He knelt beside the calf, his brow furrowed in concentration. He knew how to set a bone, but a calf was a different matter. It was delicate, and one wrong move could be fatal. Kiona knelt beside him, her eyes assessing the wound. She spoke a few words to the cow in a soft, soothing tone, a language the animal seemed to understand. The mother cow, instead of bucking at their presence, calmed down, its low moans of distress turning into soft breaths. "I can do it," Kiona said, her voice firm. "I know how to heal." Cal looked at her skeptical. He knew Native American healing was often seen as superstition and magic, not real medicine. "I don't know, Kiona. This is a bad break. I've got to set it." "No," she insisted, her eyes meeting his. "You will hurt it. It will break again. I can do it without the pain. I know what the herbs can do." She gestured to the surrounding land. "The spirits of the earth, they help us. They give us the knowledge. I am not magic. I am a healer." Cal hesitated. He was a man of logic and practicality, but he had also seen what Kiona could do. He had seen how she moved with the land, how she understood its secrets. He saw the genuine conviction in her eyes. It was a risk, but the alternative was to let the calf suffer, and he couldn't stomach that. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Show me." Kiona, with a quiet confidence that surprised him, went to a small patch of weeds near the creek. She carefully plucked a few leaves and roots, crushing them between her hands to make a paste. She returned to the calf, and with gentle, practiced hands, she began to clean the wound. She then took a few small branches from a nearby bush, snapping them into a rudimentary splint. Cal watched, mesmerized. She worked with an almost surgical precision, her movements deliberate and sure. She applied the herbal paste, the center mix of bitter earth and sweet sage, and then, with a swift, clean motion, she snapped the broken leg back into place. The calf let out a small, pained bleat, but then it settled, its eyes on Kiona, as if it understood she was helping it. She then wrapped the leg in a strip of soft leather from her tunic, securing the splint. The entire process took less than an hour. When she was finished, she looked up at Cal, her face calm and unreadable. "Now we wait," she said. "The plants, they will help the healing. The leg will set strong." Cal knelt, examining her work. The splint was sturdy and well made. The herbal poultice seemed to have stopped the bleeding. He had to admit, he was impressed. "I'll be damned," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "You're a healer." Kiona looked at the calf, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I told you, we are not just good for work, we are good for healing. We are a part of the land." The calf was a silent witness to their growing trust. Over the next few weeks, Kiona tended to it with the same quiet care she had used on the day of the injury. She changed the splint, cleaned the wound, and applied fresh poultices. The calf in turn grew stronger and more active, its legs slowly healing, a testament to her skill. The incident with the calf was a turning point. It had shown Cal a side of Kiona he hadn't known existed. It had shown him that her strength was not just physical, but spiritual and intellectual. It was a quiet, profound kind of power. And it was a power he had come to respect. He had risked his money to buy her freedom, and she had now repaid him with a gift that money could not buy. She had shown him that he had been right to trust her. She had shown him that there was more to her, and to her people, than the prejudice that a man like Jedediah represented. The walls between them had not vanished entirely, but they had begun to crumble. And for the first time, Cal felt a sense of hope for the future of his ranch, and for the life that was unfolding between the two of them. The news of the healed calf, spread through the sparse community of ranchers, carried on the wind and the occasional visit to the general store. The ranch hands and small-time farmers, superstitious and curious, began to whisper about Cal's new help. The whispers were not of admiration, but of suspicion. A Native American healer, using strange herbs and incantations, was something they couldn't understand, and what they couldn't understand, they feared. Jedediah Shaw, of course, was the main source of the venomous rumors. He told anyone who would listen that Kiona was a witch, that she was a danger to the whole valley. He claimed that the calf's healing was just a trick, a precursor to some dark magic that would be unleashed on the unsuspecting white men. Cal, for his part, ignored the rumors. He was a man of logic, not of superstition. He saw the calf walking on its own, strong and healthy, and he knew Kiona's healing was real. He had trusted her, and she had delivered. That was all that mattered. One afternoon, a small group of riders, led by Jedediah, appeared at the edge of the ranch. They were a motley crew, a few of Jedediah's hired hands and some of the more fearful ranchers from the area. They stopped their horses and sat in a menacing silence, a clear message of intimidation. Cal, who was working on the roof of the barn, saw them, and his heart sank. He climbed down, his face a mask of weary resignation, and walked out to meet them, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "Jedediah," he said, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "We've been talking, Cal," Jedediah said, his eyes narrowed. "We don't like what's going on here. This savage you've got on your land, she's a danger to all of us." "She's not a danger," Cal replied, his hand tightening on the rifle. "She's a healer. She saved my calf." A sneer spread across Jedediah's face. "A healer or a sorceress? We don't need her kind around here, Cal. It's not right. She needs to be on a reservation where she belongs." Cal took a step forward. "She's a free woman. I bought her from a trader, and she's free. She can do as she pleases. She's not bothering anyone." "She's bothering us," one of the other ranchers said, his voice shaky with fear. "My wife is worried, Cal. She's afraid to even let the kids out to play. We don't want a witch living in our valley." Cal sighed, a deep, exasperated sound. "She's not a witch. She's a good person. And this is my land. You can't tell me who I can and can't have on my property." Jedediah's gaze was cold, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Maybe we can't, but we can make sure your business dries up, your cattle can get lost, your fences can get cut." It's a lonely valley, Cal. A man can find himself in a lot of trouble when his neighbors aren't his friends. It was an open threat, a clear act of intimidation. Cal felt the anger rise in his chest. He looked at the faces of the men, a mix of fear and hatred, and he knew he was outnumbered. He was a man fighting a war against an entire world of prejudice. "Get off my land," Cal said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you, now." The men hesitated, but seeing the steel in his eyes, they knew he meant it. Jedediah, however, had one more parting shot. "You've chosen your side, Cal. You've chosen a savage over your own people. You're alone now. Don't come crying to us when she turns on you." With that, Jedediah and the other riders turned their horses and rode away, leaving a thick cloud of dust in their wake. Cal stood there for a long time, the rifle still clutched in his hand, the words of the threat ringing in his ears. He was alone. He had chosen Kiona over the comfort of his community, and now he would have to face the consequences. Kiona, who had been watching the whole exchange from the window of the cabin, walked out and stood beside him. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a quiet, powerful support. "You should have let them," she said, her voice soft. "You should not have fought for me. Now they will hate you too." Cal shook his head. "They were wrong, Kiona. They were wrong to threaten me, and they were wrong about you. I couldn't just stand by and let them say those things." Kiona looked at him, her heart filled with a complex mix of gratitude and fear. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry for the trouble I have brought you." Cal looked at her, his tired eyes meeting her gaze. "You haven't brought me trouble, Kiona. You've brought me help, and maybe a little bit of hope." He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "We're in this together now. We'll face them together." The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence of shared purpose. They were two outcasts, standing on a patch of land that was now their fortress, facing a world that wanted to tear them apart. The threat was real, and the danger was growing. But for the first time, they were not just a man and a woman in a desolate landscape. They were a team. The threats from Jedediah and his group were just the beginning. The biggest enemy, however, was not men, but the land itself. The drought, a relentless and unforgiving force, had been tightening its grip on the valley. The small stream that ran through the ranch was now a dry, cracked bed. The well was barely a trickle. The pasture, already sparse, was now nothing more than a field of yellow dust. The cattle, thin and weak, lowed in constant thirst. Cal spent his days hauling water from a distant muddy pond, a task that was as backbreaking as it was heartbreaking. He watched his herd, his life's work, slowly dying of thirst, and with each passing day his hope dwindled. Kiona, however, did not give up. She spent her days walking the dry land, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of life, any sign of water. She was not looking for a well or a stream. She was looking for the subtle signs of nature that only a person of her heritage could see. The color of the soil, the types of plants that still survived, the flight patterns of the birds. She was searching for a hidden spring, a place where the earth itself held a secret source of life. Cal, however, was losing faith. "It's no use, Kiona," he said one evening, his voice heavy with defeat. "I've lived here for 10 years. There's no other water. The land's just bone dry. It's a losing battle." Kiona looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "The land has secrets. You just have to know how to listen. The earth, it talks to us. It tells us where the water is hidden. You have to be quiet and listen." Cal shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "I've been listening, Kiona, and all I hear is the sound of my cattle dying." Kiona didn't argue. She just went back to her search. She knew the man was in despair, but she also knew that despair was the enemy. She was a survivor. She had survived a massacre, and she had survived a life of being hunted. She would not let this drought take away what little she had left. One afternoon she came back to the ranch, her face streaked with dirt but a look of triumph in her eyes. "I found it," she said, her voice a breathless whisper, "a hidden spring. Not big, but it is there. I can feel the water in the ground." Cal looked at her, his heart filled with a flicker of hope, but his mind still filled with doubt. "Where?" Kiona pointed to a small, unassuming rise of land on the far side of the property, a place he had passed 1,000 times without a second thought. "The soil, it is a different color, and the plants, they are a little bit greener. The water is there, just below the surface." Cal, with a desperate hope, took a shovel and followed her. They walked for half an hour until they reached the spot she had pointed to. The ground was hard and dry, the same as everywhere else. "Kiona, are you sure?" he asked, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "I am sure," she said, her voice unwavering. "You have to trust me." Cal, with a final, desperate heave, plunged the shovel into the earth. It was hard going, the ground packed down like concrete. He worked for hours, the sun beating down on his back, sweat dripping into his eyes. He dug a hole 3 feet deep, then 4, and still nothing but dry, dusty earth. He stopped, his body aching, his hope gone. "It's no use," he said, dropping the shovel. "There's nothing here." Kiona, who had been watching him with a quiet patience, took the shovel. She began to dig, her movements powerful and efficient. She dug for another 10 minutes, and then, with a soft squelching sound, the shovel broke through to something. A small trickle of water, dark with mud, began to seep into the hole. Cal stared at it, speechless. A miracle. Kiona had been right. She had found a source of life in a world of death. They worked together, digging and clearing, until a small pool of water, muddy but undeniably there, began to form. It was not a gushing spring, but it was enough. Enough to save the cattle, enough to save the ranch, enough to save them both. As the sun began to set, they stood by the small pool, watching the cattle, led by Cal, drink the life-giving water. The lowing was a sound of relief and gratitude. Cal looked at Kiona, his eyes filled with a new level of respect and awe. "You saved us," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "You saved everything." Kiona, however, simply smiled. "I told you. The earth has secrets. You just have to listen." The drought was not over, but for the first time in a long time, the ranch had a fighting chance, and the man who had bought a savage woman in a market had learned a lesson that would change his life forever. That true strength was not in a rifle or a fence, but in a quiet connection to the land, and in the power of a trust that had been born out of an impossible situation. The discovery of the hidden spring changed everything. It was a sign of hope, a tangible victory against the forces of nature and the men who had wished them to fail. The cattle, slowly but surely, began to regain their strength. The ranch, though still a far cry from prosperous, was no longer on the brink of collapse. Word of the spring spread, of course, carried by the same bitter winds that had brought the rumors of Kiona's witchcraft. This time, however, the whispers were laced with a grudging respect. It was a strange kind of power, this ability to find water where no one else could. A power that they couldn't dismiss as easily as they had her healing abilities. Jedediah, however, was not so easily swayed. The success of the ranch was a direct affront to his prophecy of doom. He saw it as a kind of black magic, a confirmation of his darkest fears. The fact that the woman he had so despised had saved his rival's ranch was a humiliation he could not bear. One morning, as Cal and Kiona were working on a new fence line, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was not from the valley. He was a man with a hard face, a bounty hunter's sneer, and a well-worn rifle slung over his shoulder. He rode with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the ranch with a predatory gaze. He dismounted by the barn, his boots silent in the dust. He looked at the cattle, then at the healed calf, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Caleb O'Malley?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "That's me," Cal said, stepping forward, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he had leaned against the fence post. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said, his eyes now on Kiona. "A native woman. Goes by the name Kiona. Tall, strong-built. Was sold in a market in Dodge City a few weeks back. A rancher bought her. Said she was a savage. You wouldn't happen to know anything about her, would you?" Cal's blood ran cold. The man was a bounty hunter. He had been sent to find Kiona. He looked at her and she had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the man. There was a flicker of something in her gaze. Not fear, but a deep, bitter recognition. "I don't know who you're talking about," Cal said, his voice firm. "I don't have anyone like that here, just me and my hired help." The bounty hunter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't lie to me, O'Malley. I know she's here. I've been tracking her since she was sold. Word got out that she was with a rancher, and then that same rancher started getting lucky. I put two and two together. She's a good luck charm, isn't she? A witch, some say." Kiona finally spoke, her voice flat and emotionless. "Who sent you?" The bounty hunter looked at her, his smile widening. "The trader from Dodge City. He found out she was a special kind of property. A kind of property that's wanted by a very wealthy man back east. I'm here to bring her back." He took a step towards her, his hand moving to the rifle on his shoulder. "I'm offering $1,000 for her, to the man who gets her back." He looked at Cal. "That's a nice sum for a rancher on his last leg, ain't it? You could pay off all your debts." Cal's heart pounded in his chest. $1,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to save his ranch, to get a fresh start, to buy new cattle and fix the barn. It was the solution to all his problems. He looked at Kiona. She was standing tall, her head held high, her eyes defiant. She was not a prize. She was not a possession. She was a human being. "Get off my land," Cal said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you touch her." The bounty hunter's smile vanished. "You're a fool, O'Malley. You're giving up a fortune for a wild animal. She'll get you killed. She's a danger to herself and to everyone around her." Kiona spoke again, her eyes fixed on the man. "You will not take me. I will not go back to that life." The bounty hunter sneered. "You think you have a choice?" He began to unshoulder his rifle, the cold metal a sign of his deadly intent. "She's a free woman," Cal said, his hand now on the butt of his own rifle. "And this is my home. Get off my land or I'll put a bullet through you." The bounty hunter, seeing the fire in Cal's eyes, saw that he was not bluffing. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made him a dangerous man. He looked at Kiona, then back at Cal, and a look of pure hatred crossed his face. "Fine," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll be back. I always get what I'm paid for." He mounted his horse and rode away, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing in the silent valley. Cal and Kiona stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by their breathing. The threat was not from a small-town rancher anymore. It was from a man who had a vendetta and a mission, and he would not stop until he had Kiona in chains again. Cal looked at her, his face grim. "He's not lying. He'll be back, and he'll bring others. We've got to be ready." Kiona nodded, her eyes filled with a new fierce determination. "I know, but I am not afraid, because I am not alone anymore, and I will not be a slave again." The ranch, their safe haven, was now a target. The quiet life they had built together was now in jeopardy. But they were no longer alone, and for the first time they would face the threats of the world as a team, bound together not by chains, but by a shared purpose. Their fight for survival had just begun. The threat from the bounty hunter, a man named Silas Thorne, was a physical presence that settled over the ranch like a storm cloud. He had promised to return, and Cal and Kiona knew he would. They spent the next few days in a state of high alert, their work a constant balance between the needs of the ranch and the need for vigilance. The quiet companionship they had built was now a partnership in survival. They took turns keeping watch, a rifle always within reach. Kiona, with her keen senses honed by a life in the wilderness, was the better sentinel. She could hear the faintest rustle of a leaf, the softest snap of a twig, sounds that a white man would mistake for the wind. She taught Cal to listen differently, to hear the language of the land and its warnings. "The air is still," she said one evening, as they sat by the fire, the stars a brilliant canopy above them. "Too still. The animals, they are quiet. They know something is coming." Cal, who had been about to dismiss her words as superstition, listened. The usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the call of a lone coyote, were absent. The silence was eerie, unnatural. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "I do not know," Kiona replied, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "But it is a human shadow, not an animal. A man." Cal stood, his hand going to his rifle. He scanned the perimeter of the ranch but saw nothing. The darkness was absolute, a black curtain that hid 1,000 secrets. "It could be Jedediah," he muttered. "He's probably just trying to scare us." "It is not Jedediah," Kiona said with a certainty that made him believe her. "This is a hunter. He moves like a hunter. He is patient." They spent the rest of the night on edge, their eyes straining to see into the darkness, their ears straining to hear the smallest sound. But there was nothing. The night was silent, and the unseen shadow never revealed itself. The next morning, they found the signs. Near the hidden spring, Kiona pointed to a faint set of footprints in the soft, muddy earth. They were not from a ranch hand, but from a man who wore custom-made boots. The prints were deep, a sign of a heavy, determined stride, and near the main cabin they found a small piece of cloth, torn from a man's coat. "He was watching us," Cal said, his voice a low growl of anger. "He was here. He was watching our every move." Kiona nodded, her face grim. "He is looking for a weakness. He is a predator. He is trying to make us nervous, to make us make a mistake." The knowledge that Silas Thorne was out there, a phantom in the night watching them, was a weight on their souls. They were no longer just fighting for their ranch, they were fighting for their lives. The constant vigilance was exhausting, wearing them down physically and mentally. The simple, honest work of the ranch was now a backdrop to a dangerous game of cat and mouse. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a small, weary dog from a nearby ranch limped into their camp. It was skinny and covered in burrs, a stray that had clearly been on the road for a long time. It collapsed near the fire, its tail thumping weakly against the ground. Cal, his heart heavy, offered the dog a piece of dried meat. The dog devoured it, then looked at him with grateful, tired eyes. "Poor thing," Cal said, stroking its head. "Looks like someone lost their dog, or maybe they just ran it off." Kiona, however, was not so quick to trust. Her eyes were on the dog, but her attention was on something else. She knelt and began to feel the dog's coat, her hands moving with a practiced touch. "What is it?" Cal asked. Kiona didn't answer. She found what she was looking for, a small, almost invisible leather pouch tied to the dog's collar. She took it and opened it. Inside was a single tiny twisted feather. It was a sign, a symbol. It was a warning from a man who spoke the language of the wilderness. "What does it mean?" Cal asked, his voice a whisper. Kiona's face was pale in the firelight. "It means he is close. It means he is a ghost. It means he has been here before. It is a message. He wants us to know he can get to us. He can get to our families. It is a sign of what he will do. It is a warning to us both." The dog, which had been a welcome distraction from their worries, was now a messenger of doom. It was a symbol of their helplessness. They had no idea where the man was, but he knew where they were. He knew their every move. The fight was no longer a simple one. It was a battle of wits, a battle of wills. It was a war against an unseen enemy, a shadow who moved like the wind and who would not rest until he had what he came for. The ranch was no longer their sanctuary. It was now their battlefield. The unnerving silence of the night, followed by the discovery of the feather, had a profound effect on Cal and Kiona. The subtle menace of Silas Thorne had become a tangible reality, a persistent fear that gnawed at their nerves. They were living in a state of constant dread, unable to fully relax even for a moment. Sleep was a restless, fitful affair, and their work was punctuated by frequent anxious glances at the horizon. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to cast its long shadows across the valley, Cal discovered a problem. The small herd of cattle, their only real asset, was gone. The pasture gate was open, a rope left carelessly on the ground, a crude, amateurish attempt to make it look like they had simply wandered off. "Damn it," Cal said, his voice a low growl of anger. "He's trying to get to us through our livelihood. He's trying to break us." Kiona knelt, examining the ground. The hoofprints were fresh. The cattle had not wandered. They had been driven. And there, mixed in with the hoofprints, were the unmistakable bootprints of Silas Thorne. He was not just watching them. He was actively trying to destroy them. "We have to go after them," Cal said, his face grim. "They're all we have." Kiona nodded. "I will go with you. I can track them. I know the way of the land." Cal didn't hesitate. He knew he would be lost without her. Her knowledge of the wilderness was far superior to his. He saddled up Sundance, and Kiona mounted a sturdy mare from the corral, a horse she had come to call Spirit. They set off, following the faint trail of the hoofprints, their hearts filled with a desperate hope. The trail led them west, into a rugged, mountainous terrain that Cal was not familiar with. It was a dangerous landscape, full of narrow canyons and steep cliffs. The terrain was perfect for an ambush. Cal felt a growing sense of unease. This was a trap. Silas was not a man who would simply run off a herd. He was a hunter, and he had lured them into his territory. As they rode deeper into the canyon, the trail became clearer, almost too clear. It was a sign that the cattle were still close, but it was also a sign that the trap was about to be sprung. "It is too easy," Kiona whispered, her eyes scanning the cliffs above them. "He wants us to follow." Cal nodded, his hand on his rifle. "He's waiting for us." Suddenly a shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. A bullet whizzed past Cal's head, and a splinter of wood flew from the rifle stock. He ducked, pulling on Sundance's reins, the horse rearing in alarm. "It's a trap!" he yelled. "Kiona, get back!" But it was too late. From both sides of the canyon, men on horseback emerged, their rifles aimed at them. There were 4 of them, led by Silas Thorne, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. "Got you," Silas said, his voice a low chuckle. "I knew you'd be stupid enough to follow the herd. Now let's make this easy, shall we? You give me the woman and I'll let you go. You get your cattle back and I'll even throw in $100 for your troubles." Cal's heart pounded. He was outnumbered and outgunned. He looked at Kiona, his eyes filled with a desperate apology. He had led her into a trap. "Don't do it, Cal," Kiona said, her voice filled with steel. "He will kill you either way." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "She's a smart one." "She's right, Rancher. I'll kill you no matter what. But you can die a rich man or you can die a poor man. The choice is yours." Cal, however, did not hesitate. He had made a promise to Kiona. He would not betray her. He had seen the way she had fought for him, the way she had healed his calf, the way she had found water. He was not a man who would abandon his partner in the face of danger. "I won't give her to you," Cal said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "You'll have to kill me." Silas's smile vanished. "So be it." He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, Kiona, with a swift animal-like speed, grabbed a small stone from the ground and hurled it at the horse of the man closest to her. The stone hit the horse's flank, and the animal reared in pain, throwing its rider to the ground. The sudden chaos was the opening they needed. Cal spurred Sundance forward, firing his rifle at the man who had been thrown. The man cried out, clutching his leg, and his rifle fell to the ground. Silas, enraged, fired at Cal, but the shot went wide. Kiona, with an agility that defied her size, jumped from her horse and took cover behind a large boulder. She had no rifle, but she had her knowledge of the land, and she had her wits. The canyon became a battlefield. Shots rang out, echoing off the rock walls. Cal, an expert marksman, used the cover of the terrain to his advantage, picking off one of the men. Silas, however, was a professional, a hunter who had seen 100 fights. He was patient and methodical, and he knew the terrain. The fight was a desperate one, a battle for survival. Cal, outnumbered and outgunned, was fighting for his life, and for the life of the woman who had become his partner. He was fighting for his freedom, and for her freedom. The world had tried to break them, but they had refused to be broken, and now they would fight for their right to live. The ambush in the canyon had turned into a desperate, chaotic firefight. Cal, a rancher who was more used to fixing fences than fighting for his life, was pushed to his limits. He moved from rock to rock, his rifle a deadly extension of his will. He had always been a solitary man, but now, with Kiona fighting by his side, he felt a strength he never knew he had. She was a silent but powerful presence, her knowledge of the land a constant source of guidance. She would signal to him, a subtle gesture of her hand, a slight shift of her head, and he would know where to move, where to find cover. She was a ghost in the landscape, a natural warrior who moved with a grace and a purpose that belied her size. "He is on the high ground," she called out, her voice a low whisper. "He is trying to flank you." Cal ducked as a bullet ricocheted off the rock he was hiding behind. He looked up and saw Silas, his face a mask of fury, moving along the ridge above them, a deadly predator stalking his prey. "Damn it," Cal muttered. "He's got the advantage." Kiona, however, had an idea. She had a deep, almost instinctual knowledge of the canyon's fragile ecosystem. She knew the dry, brittle brush that covered the floor of the canyon. She knew that in a drought, it would burn like tinder. "The wind!" she yelled, her eyes on the small but growing breeze that was beginning to pick up. "Use the wind!" Cal looked at her, his mind racing. The wind, the dry brush. A desperate, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. He pulled a match from his pocket, his hands trembling. It was a risk. A fire could easily get out of control and kill them both. But it was a risk he had to take. He lit the match and threw it into a patch of dry sagebrush. The flames, at first a small flickering tongue, quickly grew into a hungry roar. The wind, as Kiona had predicted, began to whip the flames forward, creating a wall of fire that raced across the canyon floor, a fiery barrier between them and Silas and his men. The canyon became a maelstrom of heat, smoke, and chaos. The men, caught off guard, began to retreat, their curses and shouts swallowed by the roar of the fire. Silas, his face a mask of rage, fired a few more desperate shots. But he was forced to fall back, his plans thwarted by a woman who had used the very land he hunted on as a weapon. The fire, however, was a double-edged sword. It was getting out of control, spreading rapidly up the canyon walls, threatening to engulf them both. The smoke was thick and chokingly hot, and the air was filled with the smell of burning wood and sage. "We have to go," Cal yelled, his voice raw. "We have to get out of here." Kiona nodded, her eyes watering from the smoke. She pointed to a small hidden crevice in the canyon wall. There, it is a way out. They scrambled up the rocky, treacherous path, the heat of the fire on their backs, the roar of the flames in their ears. They finally emerged on a small plateau, exhausted and covered in ash, but alive. From their perch, they watched the fire rage below them, a fiery inferno that consumed the canyon. The cattle, by some miracle, had been driven further down the canyon away from the flames and were safe, but Silas and his men were nowhere to be seen. They had been forced to retreat, their ambush a complete and utter failure. Cal and Kiona sat for a long time, their bodies shaking with exhaustion, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had survived. They had fought a professional hunter and his men, and they had won. "You're a genius, Kiona," Cal said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and relief. "You saved us." Kiona, however, simply shook her head. "I did not save us. The land saved us. It gave us a way to fight. I just listened." The fight had been a victory, but it had also been a profound realization for Cal. He had always seen himself as a man of the land, but he had only ever seen its harshness, its unforgiving nature. Kiona, however, had shown him its other side, its power, its wisdom. She was a daughter of this land, and she had taught him to see it not as an enemy but as a friend. The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one, filled with a new, profound respect. The fire was a memory, a scar on the land, but it was also a sign of their strength. They had faced a threat that was not of their making, and they had not backed down. They had stood together, and they had won. Their bond, forged in the fires of battle, was now unbreakable. The days following the canyon fire were a time of rebuilding and recovery. The cattle returned to the ranch were still thin, but they were no longer dying. The small spring, their life source, was a constant reminder of their victory, but the victory had come at a cost. The men of the valley, already fearful and suspicious, now looked at Cal and Kiona with a new kind of fear. They had seen the smoke from the fire, they had heard the stories. The wild native woman had used her magic to summon fire and defeat her enemies. Jedediah Shore, of course, was the main purveyor of these dark tales. He told anyone who would listen that Cal had made a deal with the devil, that he had allied himself with a witch. He claimed that the fire was a sign of the valley's coming doom, and that they were all in danger as long as the savage was on the land. The rumors, however, were just a symptom of a much deeper problem. The fear was a quiet, insidious thing. Ranchers who had once nodded to Cal on the road now avoided his gaze. Men who had once shared a drink with him in town now turned their backs. The valley was slowly, but surely, turning against them. One afternoon, Cal rode into town for supplies. He needed new fence posts, feed for the livestock, and a few other essentials. He felt the cold stares, the hushed whispers, the open hostility. He was no longer just a struggling rancher. He was a pariah. He went into the general store, and the silence was immediate and deafening. The store owner, a man he had known for years, a man named Hank, looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Afternoon, Cal," Hank said, his voice flat. "Heard you've been having some trouble, and some success." The word was laced with a venomous undertone. "We're doing all right, Hank," Cal said, ignoring the subtext. "I need a few things, a dozen fence posts, 2 bags of feed, and a sack of flour." Hank looked at him, then at the other customers in the store, who were all watching with open curiosity. "Don't know if I can help you, Cal. My store, it's a place for decent folk, and my customers. They don't like me doing business with your kind of folk." Cal's heart sank. This was it. The boycott. The valley's silent punishment for his choice. "Hank, this isn't fair. I haven't done anything to you. Kiona hasn't done anything to anyone." "That's a matter of opinion," Hank said, his voice hardening. "There are a lot of people who think you've brought a lot of trouble to this valley. My business is hurting. People don't want to come here. They're afraid of your friend." Cal's anger flared. "So what? You're going to let a woman die of hunger? You're going to let my ranch fall to ruin just because of some fool's rumors?" "It ain't just rumors, Cal," a man from the back of the store said. "That fire, it was unnatural. It was a sign from God. He's telling us to get rid of the savage." Cal took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That fire saved our lives. It was not magic. It was a last resort. We were being hunted by a man who was trying to kill us. And Kiona, she is a good woman. She is not a savage, and she is not a witch. She is a healer, and she is my friend." The other men in the store looked at him, their faces a mix of fear and hatred. They were not listening. They were not hearing his words. They were just seeing the man who had sided with an enemy. Cal, defeated, turned and walked out of the store, his hands empty. He was a man without a country, a man without a community. He was alone, and he was being punished for his kindness. He rode back to the ranch, his heart heavy. He felt the weight of his isolation. He had made a choice, and he was now paying the price. He looked at the valley, a landscape that was once a source of comfort and now felt like a prison. When he returned, Kiona was waiting for him. She saw the empty wagon, the defeat in his eyes. She didn't have to ask. She already knew. "They have turned their backs on you," she said, her voice soft, "because of me." "It's not your fault," Cal said, his voice flat. "It's their fear. They're just cowards." Kiona, however, did not believe him. "It is my fault. I am an outsider. I am a stranger. They will never accept me. And because of me, you will lose everything, your ranch, your life." Cal looked at her, his heart aching with a profound, unspoken sorrow. He had saved her from a life of chains, but he had brought her into a world of a different kind of chains, the chains of hatred, of prejudice, of fear. "I won't lose it," he said, his voice filled with a new, fierce resolve. "We won't lose it. We have the ranch. We have the water. We have us. We don't need them. We will survive, together." The valley was a place of whispers and shadows, but in their small cabin, in their own little world, they had a sanctuary. They had a bond that was stronger than any of the forces that were trying to break them. They were alone, but they were together. And in the face of a world that had turned its back on them, that was all that mattered. The boycott from the town had a crippling effect on the ranch. They were running low on supplies, and the lack of a community to trade with or sell their cattle to meant that their future was bleak. Cal and Kiona, however, did not give up. They became more resourceful. Kiona showed Cal how to trap small game for food, how to forage for edible plants, and how to use every part of an animal. They were not just surviving, they were learning to live off the land in a way that Cal never could have on his own. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, a horse approached in the distance. They both tensed, their hands going to their rifles. The rider was not from the valley. He was a man on a mission, and he was not alone. A group of riders, led by Silas Thorne, emerged from the darkness. There were more of them this time, at least half a dozen, all of them armed and grim-faced. Silas, his face a mask of cold satisfaction, rode up to the cabin and dismounted. "Evening, O'Malley," he said, his voice a low, mocking growl. "Told you I'd be back. This time I'm not leaving without my prize." Cal stood in front of Kiona, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "She's not a prize. She's a person, and you're not taking her." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We'll see about that. I'm not here to play games, O'Malley. I'm here to finish what I started. The town's not helping you anymore, is it? They've turned their backs on you. You're alone. You don't stand a chance." "We're not alone," Cal said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We're together." Silas's eyes narrowed. "That's a fine sentiment, rancher, but it won't save you. I'm a professional. My men are professionals. We don't fail." He gestured to one of his men, who dismounted and began to walk towards the cabin. Kiona, seeing the man, stepped out from behind Cal, a small knife in her hand. "I will not be a prisoner again," she said, her voice low and filled with steel. "You will not take me." Silas laughed. "You think you can stop us? You're a woman. A savage." Kiona, however, was not intimidated. "I am a warrior. I am the last of my people. I will fight for my freedom until my last breath." The man who had been walking towards her hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had heard the rumors. He had seen the stories of the woman who could summon fire. Silas, however, had no such fears. "Take her," he commanded, by any means necessary. The men, spurred on by his command, began to move towards them. Cal raised his rifle, and Kiona stood ready, the small knife in her hand. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were not afraid. They had faced death before, and they would face it again, together. The ranch became a battlefield. The night air was filled with the shouts of men, the crack of gunfire, and the low guttural sounds of Kiona's war cries. She was a whirlwind of motion, a force of nature. She moved with a speed and a ferocity that defied her size, a blur of buckskin and fury. She was not fighting just for her life. She was fighting for her dignity, for the memory of her people, for the freedom that had been so cruelly stolen from her. Cal, for his part, fought with a desperate ferocity. He was not a trained warrior, but he was a man defending his home, and he was defending the woman who had become his partner. He was a man with a cause, and he was fighting for something he believed in. The fight was a brutal, chaotic one. One of Silas's men went down, a shot to the chest. Another cried out, a cut on his arm. Silas, enraged, fired a shot at Kiona, but she ducked, the bullet whizzing past her head. The fight was not going as Silas had planned. He had expected an easy victory, a simple capture, but he had not counted on the strength of their bond or on the ferocity of Kiona's fighting spirit. He had not counted on the power of a man who had been pushed to his limits and was now fighting for his life and for his soul. The fight raged on, a desperate struggle in the darkness. The ranch, once a place of quiet solitude, was now a place of violence and death. But in the midst of the chaos, a new kind of peace was being forged. The peace of two people who had found each other in a world of hatred and had chosen to fight for their freedom, together. The battle on the ranch was a vicious, short-lived affair. Silas Thorne, a professional who had underestimated his opponents, found himself in a fight he hadn't bargained for. Kiona, with her primal ferocity, and Cal, with his desperate resolve, were a formidable team. They were not trained soldiers, but they were fighting with a purpose that their attackers lacked. One of Silas's men, a tall, burly man, lunged at Kiona, his hands outstretched. She moved with a quickness that was almost unnatural, ducking under his arm and driving her elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, and she used the momentum to grab his rifle. With a swift, practiced motion, she twisted it out of his hands and tossed it to Cal. Cal, with two rifles now at his disposal, was a one-man army. He fired a shot at the ground near another man, who yelped in fear and ran for the cover of the darkness. The men who had been expecting a simple capture were now in full retreat. They were not fighting a rancher and a woman. They were fighting a force of nature. Silas, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, was the last to stand. He had come here for a prize, and he was not leaving empty-handed. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Kiona, his eyes filled with a cold, malevolent hatred. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from the darkness. It was a single, precise shot that hit him in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, his rifle clattering to the ground. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, and saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was Jedediah Shaw. "I told you I'd get you, savage," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. "You're a disgrace to the white man's world. And you," he said, turning to Cal, "are a fool. I told you she was trouble." Cal's heart sank. He had defeated Silas, only to find himself in a new, more dangerous confrontation. He was caught between two worlds, and they were both trying to destroy him. But Kiona, however, did not flinch. She had a cold, almost detached look in her eyes. "You came here to kill me just like them. What makes you different?" "I'm not like them," Jedediah snarled. "I'm a white man. I'm doing this for my people, for the land. This is our land." "Your land?" Kiona scoffed. "You take the land, you kill the people, you call it yours. You know nothing of the land. It is not yours to take. It gives, but it can also take. It is a part of me, and I am a part of it." The words hung in the air, a profound truth that was lost on Jedediah. He was a man of the earth, but he had never truly understood it. He had always seen it as something to be tamed, to be owned. Kiona, however, saw it as a living, breathing thing, a thing that had a life and a will of its own. Suddenly a flicker of light appeared in the distance. Another, and then another. A dozen men on horseback, their faces grim, rode towards them. They were the men of the valley, the men who had turned their backs on Cal, and they were all armed. Jedediah, seeing them, felt a rush of power. "They're here to help me, you see, to get rid of the savage." But the men did not stop. They rode past Jedediah, their faces filled with a cold, determined fury. They surrounded Silas and his men, their rifles aimed at them. "We heard the shots," one of the men said, his voice a low growl. "We heard the story. A man named Silas Thorne, a bounty hunter, was hired to kill Kiona. And he's here. And we heard that you were a part of it." Silas, his face pale, tried to speak, but the man silenced him with a cold glare. "We don't need bounty hunters on our land. We don't need men who kill for money. We don't need men who bring trouble to our valley. You're a disease, Thorne, and we're here to get rid of you." The men, in a silent, unspoken agreement, began to disarm Silas and his men. They were not helping Jedediah. They were helping Cal. They were making a stand against the man who had brought a professional killer to their land. They were making a stand against the man who had tried to destroy their community. Jedediah, seeing what was happening, was left speechless. He had thought they were there to help him. But they were not. They were there to help Cal, to help the man who had chosen to do the right thing. The men bound Silas and his men and prepared to take them to the nearest lawman. The victory was a strange one. It was not a victory of violence, but a victory of community. It was a victory of men who had been afraid, but who had chosen to do the right thing in the end. Cal and Kiona stood there watching the men, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. The valley, which had turned its back on them, had now come to their aid. The fear and hatred had been replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. They had not just survived. They had won. They had won the respect of their community. And as the men rode off into the night, taking Silas and his men with them, Cal looked at Kiona, and she looked at him. They had faced a world that was trying to destroy them, and they had won. They had done it together. And in their shared victory, a new kind of love was being forged, a love that was stronger than any of the hatred or prejudice that had tried to tear them apart, a love that had been born in the fires of battle and would now burn for a lifetime. The valley, which had been a place of whispers and hostility, now held an uneasy peace. The men who had come to Cal's aid that night were not friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. Silas Thorne was a danger, and the woman, the savage, had been a victim. The stories of her healing a calf and finding water in the drought, once dismissed as witchery, were now seen as acts of survival and resourcefulness. Jedediah Shaw, however, was a different matter. He was a man who had been defeated not by an enemy, but by his own people. The men had sided with Cal, and in doing so had left him isolated and alone. He was a bitter, angry man, and his hatred for Kiona had not lessened. He was a constant, simmering threat, a storm on the horizon that had not yet broken. The day after the battle, one of the ranchers, a quiet man named Thomas, rode up to Cal's ranch. He dismounted, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Cal," he said, his voice low and a little nervous, I came to apologize. We were wrong. We should have listened to you. We should have known better than to believe Jedediah's lies." Cal, his face still grim from the night's battle, nodded slowly. "Apology accepted, Thomas, but the damage is done. We lost a lot of business. And we lost a lot of trust." "I know," Thomas said, his eyes filled with a genuine regret. "But we're trying to make it right. We took up a collection. It's not much, but it's a start." He held out a small leather pouch. Cal looked at the pouch, then at Thomas. The gesture was a small one, but it was a sign of a beginning. It was a sign that the valley was changing, that the people were starting to see past their fear. "Thank you, Thomas," Cal said, taking the pouch. "It means a lot." Thomas nodded, then looked at Kiona, who was standing a few feet away, watching them with her usual quiet intensity. He had a look of genuine curiosity in his eyes. "The story's about you," he said, his voice a little shy. "They say you can heal, and you found water. Is it true?" Kiona looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "I am a part of the land," she said, her voice soft. The land gives us what we need to survive. It is a gift, not a magic. Thomas nodded, his face thoughtful. My son, he said, his voice low. He's got a bad cough. He's been sick for weeks. The doctor, he doesn't know what to do. Can you help him? The question hung in the air. It was not a question of business. It was a question of faith. It was a question of a man, a father, who had put his fear aside and was now asking for a miracle. Kiona looked at Cal, and Cal, without a word, gave her a look that said, "It's your choice." Kiona looked back at Thomas. I can try, but I do not promise a miracle. I am not a god. I am a healer. Thomas's face lit up with a profound relief. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. The visit from Thomas was a small but significant step. It was a sign that the valley was slowly but surely beginning to accept them. But it was not a complete victory. The hatred of Jedediah was still a poison on the land, and the world outside the valley was still a dangerous place. The victory was a fragile thing, a delicate truce that could be broken at any moment. But for now, in the quiet of their ranch, Cal and Kiona had a moment of peace. They had survived, and they had won. And in their victory, a new kind of respect, a new kind of trust was being forged. A trust that was deeper than any friendship, a trust that was born of a shared experience, a shared fight, and a shared victory. A trust that would be the foundation of a new, more peaceful life. Kiona's visit to Thomas's ranch was a turning point. She arrived with Cal, her hands filled with a small pouch of herbs and a quiet, determined spirit. The ranch, a modest but well-kept place, was filled with a sense of quiet dread. Thomas's wife, a kind-faced woman named Eliza, greeted them with a look of desperate hope. Their son, a small boy named Sam, lay in bed, his face pale and thin, his body racked with a persistent, hacking cough. The doctor had been there and gone, leaving behind nothing but a bottle of useless tonic and a sense of hopelessness. Kiona walked into the room, her presence a quiet but powerful thing. She knelt beside the boy, her eyes filled with a profound sorrow, taking in his small, feverish body. She spoke a few words to him in a low, soothing tone, a language the boy had never heard, but which seemed to calm his restless body. He is sick inside, Kiona said, her voice soft. The spirit of the sickness, it is in his chest. It has made a home there. Eliza looked at her, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. What do you mean? What is a spirit of sickness? Cal, who had been standing by the door, spoke up. It's just her way of talking, Eliza. She means the sickness is deep in his lungs. Kiona, ignoring them both, began her work. She took a small amount of the herbs from her pouch and crushed them into a paste. She then took a small bowl of water and a clean cloth and began to gently wipe the boy's forehead and chest. She sang a low, rhythmic song, a song of healing, a song of her people. Thomas and Eliza watched, their faces a mixture of skepticism and hope. The song was a strange, haunting melody, but it had a profound effect. The boy, who had been restless and agitated, began to relax. His breathing became a little less ragged. Kiona then took the herbal paste and, with a gentleness that was almost maternal, rubbed it on the boy's chest. The smell was strong and earthy, a mix of sage and other herbs. She then sat by his side, her hands on his forehead, and continued to sing, a steady, unwavering song of life. She stayed there for hours, a silent, unwavering presence, a force of healing. The sun began to set, and the room was filled with the soft light of the lamp. Thomas and Eliza, exhausted, sat in the corner, their eyes fixed on the woman who was trying to save their son. Finally, Kiona stood. "He will live," she said, her voice a little tired, but firm. "The spirit of the sickness, it has been weakened. It will leave his body in time, but he needs rest, he needs clean water, and he needs to be taken care of." Eliza, her face streaked with tears, rushed to the boy. His breathing was now calm and even. The fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully. He's going to be all right?" Eliza asked, her voice filled with a profound disbelief. Kiona nodded. "He will be strong again. The earth has given him life. Thomas, his face a mask of awe, walked up to her. He took her hands, and his eyes, filled with a deep, genuine gratitude, met hers. You saved him. You saved my son. I don't know how to thank you." Kiona looked at him, a soft, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "You do not need to thank me. I am a part of the earth, and the earth, it gives life. We are all a part of it." The word of the healing spread like wildfire. The men who had been afraid of her, who had called her a witch, now looked at her with a profound respect. She was not a witch. She was a healer. She was a woman who had a connection to the land that they could not understand, but they could no longer deny. The visit to Thomas's ranch was a profound moment. It was a sign that the valley was finally, truly beginning to change. The fear and hatred were slowly being replaced by a sense of grudging acceptance, and in some cases, a profound respect. Kiona had not just healed a boy, she had healed a community. And in doing so, she had found her place, a place that was not defined by the prejudice of the past, but by the promise of the future. A future where she was not an outcast, but a part of a community. The miraculous recovery of Thomas's son sent a ripple through the valley, and the whispers about Kiona changed from fear to fascination. While many were humbled and grateful, seeking her out for ailments and advice, a staunch minority, led by the bitter Jedediah Shaw, remained defiant. For them, Kiona's healing was not a miracle, but a confirmation of their worst fears, a sign of her unnatural powers and a dark influence on their community. Jedediah's anger festered. He saw the shift in the valley as a personal defeat. His warnings had been dismissed, his hatred had been proven to be a lie, and the man he had once seen as a quiet, insignificant rancher had become a respected figure. Cal's ranch, which Jedediah had hoped would fail, was now a place of pilgrimage for those seeking Kiona's help. One afternoon, a small group of ranchers who had once been among the most vocal critics of Cal and Kiona arrived at their ranch. They were carrying supplies and an offer of help. They were willing to trade, to work, to rebuild the community they had so foolishly tried to tear down. Cal, however, was wary. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice still tinged with suspicion. "You've been turning your back on me for months. Now you want to be friends?" A man named Robert, a gruff but honest farmer, spoke up. "We were wrong, Cal. We were afraid. We heard Jedediah's stories, and we let our fear get the better of us. But what we saw and what Kiona did for Thomas's boy, it was a sign. She's not a witch, she's a good person, and we were wrong to let her suffer." The men, in a silent, unspoken agreement, began to unload the supplies. They were not just trading, they were making amends. They were rebuilding the bridges they had so carelessly burned. Kiona, however, was not so easily swayed. She had seen the hatred in their eyes, and she was not a person who could forget it so easily. She had a long memory, a memory of a life filled with betrayal and pain. "I thank you for your help," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you must understand, you turned your backs on us when we needed you the most. You watched us struggle. And now, you come here. We do not need your help anymore. We need your trust. And that will take a long time to build." The men, humbled by her words, nodded. They knew she was right. They had made a mistake, and they would have to earn her trust. The day was filled with a cautious but productive work. The men helped to mend fences, to repair the barn, to clear the fields. They worked side by side with Cal, their laughter and conversation filling the silent valley. For the first time in a long time, the ranch felt like a part of a community. But the peace was a fragile thing. As the sun began to set, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. It was Jedediah Shaw. He saw the men, their tools, their shared laughter. He saw the community he had tried to destroy being rebuilt, and his hatred, which had been simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. He spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He rode into the midst of the men, his eyes fixed on Kiona. "You!" he yelled, his voice a low, guttural roar. "You brought this upon us. You're a curse, a witch. You've corrupted this whole valley." The men, shocked by his sudden fury, stepped back. Cal, however, stood his ground, his face grim. "Jedediah," he said, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "It's over. You lost. Just leave us alone." "I haven't lost anything," Jedediah snarled. "You've all been fooled by her. She's a demon in a human skin. She's a curse, and I'm here to end it." He reached for his rifle, his hands shaking with rage. The men, seeing the madness in his eyes, pulled out their own weapons. The truce was over. The community was divided again, and in the center of it all, a man who was consumed by hatred and a woman who was just trying to find her place in the world. The battle for the valley was about to begin. The final showdown in the valley was not a grand battle, but a quiet, tense standoff. The men who had come to help Cal were now caught in the middle of a war they didn't want. Jedediah, a man consumed by his own hatred, stood alone, his rifle aimed at Kiona. The community, which had been so close to finding peace, was now divided again. A silent, tense line drawn between two men and their beliefs. "Jedediah," Robert said, his voice a low plea. "Don't do this. We're all here. We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Jedediah roared, his eyes wild with fury. "This thing has to go. She's a disease on our land, a plague." Cal, seeing the madness in his eyes, knew there was no talking to him. This was not a man who could be reasoned with. This was a man who had lost his mind to a lifetime of hatred. "Jedediah," Cal said, his voice a low, firm command. "Lower your weapon. Leave now, or you'll be the one to pay the price." Jedediah, however, did not listen. His hatred was a blind, all-consuming thing. He had lost everything, and he was not going to let a savage take away his last shred of dignity. He was going to end it. He fired. The shot was a loud, sharp crack that echoed in the silent valley. It was aimed at Kiona. But before the bullet could reach her, Cal, with a swift, desperate lunge, pushed her to the ground, taking the bullet in his side. He cried out in pain, a sharp, guttural sound, and fell to the ground, clutching his side. Kiona, who had been pushed to the ground, looked up, her eyes wide with shock and terror. "Cal!" she screamed, her voice filled with a profound, soul-deep agony. The men who had been watching in silent horror now reacted. They had seen the hatred. They had seen the senseless violence. And they had seen a man, a good man, get shot down by his own neighbor. "Jedediah!" Robert yelled, his voice filled with a righteous fury. "You've gone too far." Jedediah, seeing what he had done, a flicker of fear in his eyes, turned and ran. He spurred his horse and rode away, a desperate, broken man. He had not won. He had lost everything, his community, his dignity, his soul. The men, ignoring him, rushed to Cal's side. Kiona was already there, her hands on his wound, her face a mask of profound sorrow. The blood was a dark, spreading stain on his shirt. "Cal," she whispered, her voice a low, desperate plea. "No. No. It's all right," he said, his voice a weak whisper. I'm all right. Just a flesh wound." But Kiona knew. Her hands, which had healed so many, could feel the deep, grievous wound. The bullet had hit him in the side, a bad, bad place. He was losing blood fast. The men, seeing the wound, knew it too. They looked at Kiona, their faces filled with a new kind of desperation. They had seen what she could do. They had seen her healing powers. Now they were asking for a miracle, a real one. "Heal him, Kiona," Robert said, his voice a low plea. "Please, you have to save him." Kiona looked at them, her eyes filled with a profound, bottomless sorrow. She had saved a calf. She had saved a boy. But she was not a god. She was a healer. And this wound was different. It was a man, a good man, who had taken a bullet for her. She knelt, her hands on his wound, her eyes closed. She began to sing, a low, guttural song of healing, a song of her people. She was not just singing for him, she was singing for her people, for her dignity, for her life. She was pouring every ounce of her spirit, every ounce of her being, into him. The men watched, their faces filled with a profound, unspoken awe. They had seen her do this before, but this was different. This was a life that had been saved by a simple act of courage. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The valley, which had been a battlefield, was now a place of profound silence, a place of hope, a place of healing. And as the last rays of light faded, Kiona opened her eyes. She had done all she could. The rest was up to him. The rest was up to fate. She had saved his life, and in doing so she had found her own. She had found a home, a community, and a purpose. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a hero, and she was a part of a new, more peaceful world. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over the ranch that had just been a battlefield. The air, thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear, was slowly giving way to the smell of sage and the gentle, cool breeze of the evening. The men of the valley, humbled and contrite, had helped carry Cal into the small cabin. Kiona, her face a mask of profound concentration, knelt beside him. The bullet had entered his side, a clean but deep wound, and his breathing was shallow, his face pale with shock and pain. He had pushed her to safety, a selfless act that had sealed their fates together. As the men stood by, helpless witnesses to the unfolding drama, Kiona took charge. Her movements were not rushed or panicked, but deliberate and sure. She asked for a clean cloth, a bowl of hot water, and a few moments of privacy. The men, now completely in awe of her, obeyed without question. They left the cabin, gathering on the porch in a silent vigil, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and profound respect. Inside, Kiona worked with a quiet, fierce intensity. She cleaned the wound with the hot water, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. She then took a pouch of dried herbs, a mix of sage, yarrow, and other plants she had gathered, and prepared herself. She crushed them into a fine powder and applied it to the wound, a natural antiseptic that would stop the bleeding and fight off infection. Her hands, which had once been bound by chains, were now hands of life. As she worked, she sang a low, rhythmic song, a song of healing and comfort, the melody a haunting tribute to her people. Her hands, which had been so powerful in battle, were now as gentle as a feather. She spoke to the wound as if it were a living thing, an intruder that needed to be convinced to leave. She spoke to Cal, her voice a low, soothing whisper, telling him to hold on, to fight, to live. Cal, in his pain-filled haze, could hear her voice. It was a melody that transcended language, a sound that went straight to his heart. He felt her hands on him, a warmth that seemed to spread through his body, pushing back the cold, creeping tendrils of death. He saw her face, her eyes filled with a grief and a determination that was more powerful than any weapon. He had saved her life, and now she was fighting for his. The night wore on, a long, agonizing wait. The men on the porch, their faces grim, did not leave. They were a community, and one of their own was fighting for his life. And the woman they had once called a savage was fighting for him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Kiona finished her work. The bleeding had stopped. The fever, which had been a fire in his body, had broken. Cal, still pale and weak, was sleeping peacefully, his breathing even and deep. Kiona, exhausted but victorious, covered him with a blanket and walked out onto the porch. The men, seeing her, rushed forward. Is he going to be all right?" Robert asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. Kiona nodded, a small, weary smile on her lips. "He will live. He is strong. He is a good man." The men let out a collective sigh of relief. They looked at Kiona, their faces a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. They had seen her fight. They had seen her heal. They had seen her love. She was no longer a stranger. She was a hero. The sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the valley. The ranch, which had been a place of violence and division, was now a place of healing and unity. The community had been broken by fear and hatred, but it had been healed by an act of selfless courage, an act that had been paid for in blood, and a life that had been saved by a simple, quiet act of faith. The chapter had ended, and a new chapter for the valley and for the two souls who had found each other, was about to begin. The days following Cal's injury were a time of profound change for the valley. The men who had come to his aid now took on the responsibility of the ranch. They brought food and supplies from town, helped with the daily chores, and stood guard against any potential threat. Their fear of Kiona had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect. They had seen her courage, her healing, and her quiet, unwavering loyalty to the man who had saved her. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of their community. The story of Jedediah's attack and Cal's miraculous survival spread quickly. The men who had been a part of the standoff told the tale with a mix of shame and pride. They spoke of the hatred that had consumed one of their own, and of the courage of a man who had defended an outcast. The story of Jedediah, a man who had lost his humanity to his own prejudice, became a cautionary tale. He was now a pariah, a man who had been cast out by his own people. Jedediah, however, had not vanished entirely. He was a ghost in the landscape, a bitter presence on the outskirts of the valley. He had ridden away, a broken man, but his hatred was still a poison on the land. He was a man who had lost his war, and he was now a man who had nothing left to lose. He was a dangerous man. Kiona, in the meantime, tended to Cal with a devotion that was both profound and beautiful. She changed his bandages, gave him her herbal concoctions, and watched over him with a fierce protectiveness. She was a healer, a protector, and a partner. She was everything he had ever needed. As Cal slowly began to recover, he and Kiona spent their days in a quiet intimacy. They talked about their pasts, their families, their dreams. Cal spoke of his late wife, Sarah, a kind and gentle woman who had loved the land with a passion that was as fierce as his own. He spoke of his loneliness, of the weight of his grief, of the quiet desperation that had been his life since her passing. Kiona, in turn, spoke of her people. She spoke of the Oglala Lakota, a people who had lived in harmony with the land, a people who had been massacred and scattered by the white man. She spoke of her family, of her father, a great warrior, and her mother, a wise and gentle healer. She spoke of the loss, of the pain, of the humiliation of her capture. She spoke of the chains, not just the ones on her hands, but the ones on her soul. In their shared stories, they found a common ground. They were two people from different worlds who had both been broken by loss and betrayal. But they were also two people who had found a new kind of family, a new kind of home in each other. They were survivors, and they were in this together. One afternoon, as Cal was strong enough to sit up on the porch, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Thomas, and he was not alone. He was with a group of men, including Robert, and they were all carrying tools and supplies. "Afternoon, Cal," Thomas said, a genuine smile on his face. "Heard you were on the mend. We came to help out." Cal, a little overwhelmed by their kindness, nodded. "Thank you, boys. You didn't have to." "We know," Robert said, "but we want to. You're a part of this community, Cal, and so is Kiona. We were wrong to leave you alone. We're here to make things right." The men, in a silent, unspoken gesture, began to work. They mended the fences, repaired the barn, and began to build a new well near the hidden spring. The ranch, which had been on the brink of collapse, was now a place of hope and renewal. The community had been broken, but it was now being rebuilt. And it was being rebuilt by two people, a rancher and a woman, who had found each other in a world of hatred and had taught a whole valley the meaning of kindness, courage, and true freedom. The healing of Cal and the rebuilding of the ranch had become a symbol of hope for the valley. The community, once divided, was now united in a common purpose, to right the wrongs of the past and to build a better future. But the peace was a fragile thing. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm that was named Jedediah Shaw. Jedediah, a man who had been defeated by his own people, was now a man with nothing left to lose. He was living as a hermit, a bitter presence on the outskirts of the valley. He watched from the shadows as the men of the valley helped Cal. He watched as the ranch, which he had hoped would fail, flourished, and his hatred, which had been a fire in his soul, was now a cold, malevolent force. He was a man with a single purpose, revenge. He knew he could not take on the entire valley. He was one man, and they were a community. But he knew their weaknesses. He knew their greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability, their newfound trust in Kiona. He knew that if he could destroy that trust, he could destroy everything. His plan was simple, and it was cruel. He would use the land, the very thing Kiona loved and respected, as a weapon. He would poison the hidden spring, the very source of their newfound prosperity. He would turn their water, their source of life, into a source of death. One dark, moonless night, Jedediah, a shadow in the darkness, rode to the hidden spring. He carried with him a large, rusty can of poisonous chemicals, a vile concoction he had purchased in a distant town. He knelt by the spring, his hands trembling with a mixture of hatred and cold, determined fury. He was going to end it. He was going to show them all. He was going to prove that he had been right all along. He was going to prove that the savage was a curse, a plague on the land. He was about to pour the poison into the water when a small, soft voice spoke from the darkness. "Do not." Jedediah's heart leaped into his throat. He dropped the can, the vile liquid spilling onto the ground, and looked up. Standing in the darkness, her face a pale oval in the gloom, was Kiona. She was a silent, ominous presence, a ghost in the night. "You," Jedediah whispered, his voice filled with a profound, soul-deep fear. "How did you find me?" "The land told me," Kiona said, her voice low and filled with a quiet power. "The land, it is a living thing. It feels the pain. It feels the hatred. It called to me. It asked me to come." Jedediah, a man of logic and practicality, scoffed. "You're a witch, a demon. You're a curse on this land." "No," Kiona said, her voice filled with a profound, unyielding sorrow. "I am not a curse. I am a part of this land. But you are a curse. You are a poison on this land. You are poisoning not just the water, but your own soul." Jedediah, his mind clouded with a lifetime of hatred, did not listen. He was a man who had lost everything, and he was not going to be lectured by a woman he despised. He reached for his rifle, his hands shaking with a desperate fury. "I'll end it," he snarled. "I'll end it all." But before he could fire, Kiona, with a swift, animal-like speed, grabbed the can of poison from the ground and hurled it at his face. The vile, burning liquid splashed onto his face, and he screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony. He dropped his rifle and stumbled back, clutching his face, his vision blurred by the burning liquid. Kiona, her face grim, walked up to him. "This is what you are," she said, her voice filled with a cold, unforgiving anger. "You are poison. You are a curse. You have brought nothing but death and destruction to this land. You are not a part of it. You are a stranger. You are a foreigner. And you will be punished by the land you have tried to destroy." Jedediah, blinded by the poison, fell to his knees, his body racked with pain. He was a man who had been defeated not by a gun, but by the very thing he had tried to destroy. He was a man who had tried to poison the land, only to be poisoned by it in return. He was a man who had lost his war, his dignity, and his soul. He was a man who was now a ghost, a shadow in the darkness, a reminder of the evil that had once plagued the valley. The victory was not a celebration. It was a quiet, somber thing. It was a reminder that hatred, like a poison, will always find its way back to the one who holds it, and that the land, like a mother, will always protect its own. The valley, which had been so close to a new beginning, had just witnessed the end of an old, bitter chapter. And in its place, a new, more peaceful one was being written. The final confrontation with Jedediah was a quiet but profound end to a long, bitter chapter. Jedediah, his face a testament to his own cruelty, was found the next morning by the men of the valley. He was taken to the nearest lawman, a man who had heard the stories and was not surprised by the outcome. Jedediah, a man who had been consumed by his own hatred, was now a man who had lost everything. He was no longer a threat. He was a cautionary tale. The valley, which had been so divided for so long, was now a place of unity and peace. The ranchers, who had once been so suspicious of Kiona, now looked at her with a profound, unspoken respect. They had seen her courage, her healing, and her quiet, unwavering loyalty to the man who had saved her. She was no longer a stranger. She was a hero. Cal, in the meantime, was on the mend. He was still weak, but his wound was healing, a testament to Kiona's skill. He spent his days on the porch, watching the ranch that was no longer his alone. It was a community ranch now, a place where men who had once been his enemies worked side by side with him, building a future that was for all of them. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Cal looked at Kiona. She was sitting on the porch, a quiet, peaceful presence in his life. He had saved her from a life of chains, and she had saved him from a life of loneliness. They were two people from two different worlds who had found a home in each other. "Kiona," he said, his voice a little hoarse, I have a question for you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. "What is it, Cal?" I want you to stay," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt emotion. "I want you to stay here, on the ranch, not as a hired hand, not as a friend, as a partner, in everything, in the ranch, in my life." Kiona's heart, which had been so broken for so long, felt a profound, beautiful flutter. She had a home, a real home, a place where she was not just accepted, but loved. "I would like that," she said, her voice a low, beautiful whisper. "I would like that very much." The moment was a profound one. It was not a grand proposal, but a simple, heartfelt request. It was a request for a future that was not defined by the prejudice of the past, but by the promise of the future. It was a request for a partnership that was not based on a transaction, but on a shared experience, a shared fight, and a shared love. The valley, which had been so divided for so long, was now a place of unity. The men, who had once been so suspicious of Kiona, now came to her for advice. They came to her for healing. They came to her for her wisdom. She was no longer a stranger. She was a part of their community. The ranch, which had been on the brink of collapse, was now a place of prosperity. The hidden spring, a testament to Kiona's skill, had become a source of life for the entire valley. The men, who had once been so focused on their own survival, were now focused on the survival of their community. The final chapter of their story was not about a battle. It was not about a victory over an enemy. It was about a victory over themselves. It was about a community that had chosen to heal. It was about a man who had chosen to love. It was about a woman who had chosen to be free. And in their choice they had created a new, more peaceful world. A world where a man who had been alone and a woman who had been a prisoner had found a home. A home that was not just a place on a map, but a place in their hearts. The days turned into weeks, and the ranch transformed. The men of the valley, in a show of profound gratitude and acceptance, worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been broken. A new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, its wood strong and straight. The fences were mended, the fields were tilled, and a new life was breathed into the desolate landscape. The community was no longer a collection of isolated ranches. It was a living, breathing network of trust and cooperation. And in the heart of it all, a quiet romance blossomed between Cal and Kiona. It wasn't a sudden, passionate fire, but a slow, steady burn. Their love was forged in the crucible of shared trauma and mutual respect. They had seen each other at their worst, broken, defeated, and on the brink of death, and had chosen to fight for each other. Their connection ran deeper than words. It was in the way Cal would bring her a cup of coffee at sunrise, in the way Kiona would instinctively know when he was in pain, in the silent strength of their hands as they worked side by side. One afternoon, Cal, now fully recovered, stood on the newly built porch. The sun was warm on his face, and the sounds of life, the lowing of the cattle, the laughter of the men, the gentle creak of the windmill, filled the air. He felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. He had lost so much, but he had gained something he never thought he would have again. A family. He turned to Kiona, who was sitting on the steps, her hands in her lap, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment. "I want to do something," he said, his voice a little hoarse with emotion. "I want to show everyone, and I want to show you, that this is our home, that we are a family." Kiona looked at him, her heart filled with a profound sense of love. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. Cal smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that reached his eyes. "I want us to get married, not for a ceremony, but for us, to show the world that we are a team, that we are together, that we are one." Kiona's heart swelled with a profound joy. She had been a prisoner, a stranger, a ghost in the world, and now she was being offered a life of love, a life of partnership, a life of family. She had been in chains, and now she was being offered a ring. She reached for his hand, her eyes filled with a beautiful, radiant love. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a profound, unyielding emotion. "Yes, Cal, I will." The men of the valley who had been working on the ranch saw the scene. They saw the quiet, profound moment between two people who had found each other in a world of hatred. They saw the man who had been a recluse and the woman who had been an outcast, and they saw the love that was a testament to their shared struggle. Robert, a man who had once been a part of the hate, walked up to them, a solemn look on his face. "Cal," he said, his voice filled with a profound, heartfelt emotion, "I would be honored to officiate the ceremony. We, the people of this valley, would be honored to be a part of it." The offer was not just a gesture, it was a profound act of acceptance. It was a sign that the community, which had once been so divided, was now a family. It was a sign that the fear had been replaced by love. It was a sign that the story of a man who had saved a woman and a woman who had saved a man was not just a story of a few people. It was a story of a community. The wedding was a quiet, simple ceremony. It was not a grand affair, but a heartfelt one. The men of the valley, their wives and children, all stood in a circle, a silent, beautiful testament to their love and to their unity. Kiona, in a simple white dress made for her by Eliza, stood beside Cal, her hand in his. They were two people from different worlds who had found a home in each other. They were two people who had been broken, but who had found a new, more beautiful life in each other. And as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, the man who had been alone and the woman who had been a prisoner were no longer just two people. They were a family. They were a part of a community. They were a part of a story that would be told for generations, a story of love, of courage, and of a quiet, beautiful, and profound victory. The years that followed were a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, became the heart of a thriving community. Cal and Kiona, now a living legend in the valley, became pillars of wisdom and strength. Their children, a son and a daughter, grew up in a world where their mother's heritage was not a source of shame, but a point of pride. The language of the Lakota, once a secret, was now a part of the valley's culture, taught and cherished by both children and adults. Kiona, with her profound knowledge of the land and her healing abilities, became a trusted advisor and healer for the entire community. She taught the ranchers how to read the land, how to find hidden springs, how to care for their animals with a gentle hand. She was no longer a savage, but a beloved and respected member of the community. Her hands, which had once been bound by chains, were now hands of life, healing, and love. Cal, for his part, became a leader. He was a man who had once been a recluse, but he was now a man who had found his purpose. He taught the men of the valley that true strength was not in a gun, but in a quiet, unwavering kindness. He taught them that a community, like a family, was only as strong as its weakest member. He taught them that a man's worth was not in his wealth, but in his character. The ranch, their home, was a symbol of their journey. The hidden spring, a testament to Kiona's knowledge, was now a source of life for the entire valley. The new barn, a testament to the community's unity, was now a place of laughter and shared meals. The fences, mended by hands that had once been enemies, were now a symbol of their shared promise. Jedediah Shaw, a man who had tried to destroy them, was a forgotten ghost. His hatred, like a poison, had consumed him, and he was now a part of the land he had tried to destroy. His story, a cautionary tale, was a reminder that hatred, like a fire, would always burn the one who held it. The final chapter of their story was not about a dramatic conclusion. It was not about a final, desperate battle. It was about a quiet, beautiful, and profound victory. It was about a community that had chosen to heal. It was about a man who had chosen to love. It was about a woman who had chosen to be free. And as the years passed, the story of the giant native woman became a legend. It was a story that was passed down from generation to generation, a story of a man who had chosen compassion over prejudice, a woman who had chosen forgiveness over revenge, and a community that had chosen love over hatred. It was a story of a promise that had been made on a dusty road in the American West, a promise that had been paid for in blood, and a promise that had been kept for a lifetime. And in their quiet, beautiful lives, Cal and Kiona, the two souls who had found each other in a world of hatred, lived a life of peace, of love, and of profound, unyielding happiness. They had been strangers, but they had become family. They had been prisoners, but they had found their freedom. They had been alone, but they had found their home. And in their story, they had taught a whole valley and a whole world that love, in the end, would always win.